welcome to the lecture on International Financial Management. In today's lecture, we will understand what carriage risk is, why it arises, how trade contracts addresses it, and most importantly, how Incoterms 2020 provide a globally standardized framework to manage it. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to explain carriage risk, identify where risk and cost transfer under each of the 11 Incoterms, and confidently distinguish between the four groups. So, what exactly is carriage risk or a transit risk? Here is the definition, the formal definition. Carriage risk is the risk that there could be a possible loss of cargo in transit or an unusual delay in delivering the goods at the destination due to problems during the transit. Now, notice two key components here. One is loss of cargo and the second is unusual delay. Now, both translate into financial loss for one of the parties. Let us now look at the three dimensions of carriage risk shown as the three cards below. First, cargo loss or damage. Goods can be stolen, damaged, or completely lost while moving across countries and oceans. This is more common than you might think. Containers fall off ships in rough weather. Goods are mislabeled and sent to the wrong port. Perishable items are damaged if refrigeration fails. When any of this happens, the immediate question is, who is going to compensate? Who files the insurance claim? If there is no prior agreement, this becomes a legal dispute. Second, unexpected delay. Even if the goods arrive intact, a delay can cause serious financial harm. Customs holds at a port, perhaps because documentation is incorrect, and this can delay shipment by days. A port strike, like those we have seen at the major European or American ports, can hold up cargo for weeks. For a buyer who has already sold the goods to the downstream customer and promised a delivery rate, this is devastating. Again, without an agreement, both parties point fingers at each other. Third, disputed liability. Without clearly written agreement, both the exporter and the importer may simultaneously refuse to accept responsibility for cost or losses during transit. The exporter might say the goods were left in a perfect condition. It is not my problem. The importer might say the goods arrived damaged. The seller must compensate. This results in litigation, damaged business relationships, and financial loss for both sides. This is the core problem that is solved by Incoterms. This slide makes the core conflict very visual. Let us read through it carefully. On the left side, the exporter's position is in blue and it is written here. The exporter is saying, I delivered the goods on time. Loss in transit is not my problem. You must arrange insurance. Freight is your cost to bear. My job ends at the factory gate. And on the right side, there is the importer positions. The importer says, I already paid for the goods. You must ensure safe delivery. Seller should provide insurance. All freight must be pre-included. Your duty ends at my warehouse. You can immediately see that both parties are making completely contradictory claims. Both positions can seem reasonable in isolation. The seller feels that once the goods leave the factory, the buyer is responsible. The buyer feels that since they paid, they should receive the goods safely at their doorstep. The only way to avoid this dispute is for both parties to agree on a comprehensive written trade contract before the shipment begins. And within that contract, they should use Incoterms, the internationally recognized framework to define responsibilities precisely. Now let us look at what such a contract should contain. A comprehensive trade contract removes all ambiguity. When parties sign it before the shipment begins, they should know exactly who does what at every stage of the transaction. This slide shows the essential items or elements. Now we see the column in which we have quantity, product, standard and specification. Exactly what is being traded, in what amount, to what quality. Second is the inspection procedure. Who inspects the goods, at what stage and according to which standard. Third is the total value of contract and the terms of delivery, which means the total price and the Incoterm being used. Fourth is taxes, duties and charges. Which taxes apply and who pays them. Fifth is period of delivery and shipment. When exactly the goods must be delivered or shipped. Sixth is packing, labeling and marking. How goods must be packed to survive transit, labeling for customs purposes. Similarly, if we look at the other column, we have terms of payment, amount, mode and currency, how much is paid when in which currency and through what instrument, such as a letter of credit or a bank transfer. Eighth is discounts, commissions, licenses and permit, just any trade specific arrangement. Then comes insurance coverage. Who arranges insurance, for what value, covering what risk. Next is documentary requirement. Which documents are needed? Bill of lading, certificate of origin, commercial invoice, etc. And guarantee clause. What happens if goods are defective upon arrival? And the last but not least is the arbitration and dispute resolution. If a dispute arises, how is it settled? Which country's court have jurisdiction? Note that the Incoterm chosen, which defines the delivery terms and the transfer of risk, feeds directly into several of these elements. Total value, insurance and period of delivery. That is why understanding Incoterm is not optional. They are central to every well-drafted trade contract. Now we come to the solution, Incoterms. Incoterms, that means international commerce terms, are the globally recognized set of rules that define the responsibilities of sellers and buyers in international trade. They are developed by the International Chamber of Commerce, that is the ICC, and a registered trademark of the ICC. This is important. Incoterms are not law. They are contractual terms. When both parties agree to use an Incoterm, they are voluntarily binding themselves to its rules. For example, if they say FOB Mumbai, now both parties know without any further negotiation exactly where the risk transfers, who pays freight and who handles export clearance. The four properties shown in the card below tell us why Incoterm matters so much. It is created by ICC. The current version is Incoterm 2020, published by International Chambers of Commerce. It replaced Incoterm 2010. Key changes in the 2020 version include DAT was renamed to DPO. The insurance requirement for CIP was upgraded from clauses C to clause A. We will revisit both of these points when we reach those specific terms. Second, it is globally recognized. The same definitions apply in India, Germany, China, United States and every other country. An exporter in Chennai and an importer in Hamburg use the same understanding of FOB. This eliminates ambiguity entirely. Third, 11 terms in 4 groups. Incoterms 2020 contains exactly 11 terms arranged in 4 groups E, F, C and D. The seller's obligation increases progressively from group E to group D. Fourth, they reduce carriage risk by clearly assigning who bears cost, who bears risk and who arranges insurance at every stage of the supply chain. Incoterms directly addresses the carriage risk problem we discussed in the previous slides. This is a crucial overview slide. There are 4 columns which form the foundation of everything. The footnote at the bottom you can see writes that minimum seller obligation is on the left and maximum seller obligation is on the right. This is the creep principle. Group E, this departure, only one term, EXW or X works. The seller does the minimum possible. Goods are simply made available at the seller premises. The buyer is responsible for absolutely everything, collecting the goods, arranging export clearance in the seller's country, freight, insurance and import clearance at the destination. This is applicable to all transport modes. Group F, main carriage unpaid. 3 terms, FCA, FAS and FOB. In all three, the seller delivers goods to a carrier or a point or a place named by the buyer. The seller handles export clearance, but the buyer pays for the main international freight. FCA applies to all transport modes. FAS and FOB apply to sea and inland waterway only. Group C, main carriage paid. 4 terms, CPT, CIP, CFR and CIF. Here the seller pays for the main international freight and in CIP and CIF also provides insurance. CPT and CIP apply to all modes while CFR and CIF are C only. Group D, arrival. 3 terms, DAP, DPU and DDP. In all three, the seller brings the goods all the way to the buyer destination. Risk stays with the seller for the longest time. DDP represents the absolute maximum obligation for the seller, including the import duties and customs in the buyer country. All three apply to all transport modes. Now see, it is not very easy to transport from one country to another country. Let's say this is a country A. Country A, while the port of the country is here, right? And the factory of the seller is here. This is seller factory. Now in between you have C here and then again you have a country B. Port of country B is here and the buyer warehouse is here. So first if the seller wants to sell, the goods should reach the port, then they should travel the whole sea, then they should reach the port of the destination country, then they should reach to the buyer warehouse. So it is a very long thing, and moreover there has to be loading and unloading every time. Now this loading and unloading, because here you might be using a truck, then you might be using a ship, right? Or you may also have a air transport, then again you will use a truck. So there will be loading and unloading so many times. So in all that there is a lot of expenses have to be incurred. So now let us talk about X works. Now in X works you can see we have a truck here, that means, and the goods here, clear? This is the buyer warehouse and this is the seller warehouse, fine. So here this picture depicts that this goods are not loaded to the truck, clear, and hence seller has the minimum obligation. It is only providing the goods at the factory, while the buyer has this buyer, we can see in buyer's obligation will be shown in the orange, while the seller's obligation will be shown in the blue. So in this case, if we see, there is no blue part in this whole rectangle. That means everything is borne by the buyer. So buyer bears all risk and cost from the seller's doorstep. Fine. Buyer handles exports, it customs in the seller's country. Now this is an unusual burden on the buyer, not seen in any other Incoterm. So here it is, the buyer pays the entire journey and it pays the whole risk. So there is a transportation cost which the buyer has to bear. Fine. There is insurance cost, again the buyer has to bear. There is export and import clearance, which again the buyer has to do, right. So seller is doing nothing, it is just making this particular goods available to the buyer at its own premises, that is its own warehouse. So here we can see the buyer bears all risk and cost from the seller's door onwards. From the moment the buyer or their carrier arrives to collect the goods, the buyer is responsible. Here is the important conceptual point. The buyer must arrange for all custom clearances, whether the export clearances or the import clearances. This is an unusual burden on the buyer, which is not seen in any other Incoterm. Now, under this arrangement, the buyer must either set up a local agent in the seller's country or ask the seller to assist, which requires a separate special arrangement. Now, let us talk about another, that is group F, and we will talk about FCA. Right here, if we see, there are the goods that were earlier placed near the warehouse of the seller have now been loaded, right. So that means at least still here the goods have been loaded, plus the truck is at a point or a place which have been specified by the buyer. So the seller, does the seller do? The seller loads the goods and also delivers the goods to a place which is named by the buyer. Now till here, the seller pays for the transportation charges and seller also bears the risk. So we can see that the seller is paying for the transportation and the insurance cost, and hence it is blue till here. Fine. Now if I say named carrier or of place, that means there can be some, suppose it is in Surat, so maybe another city, fine, where the buyer wants to pick up the goods from, fine. So the seller is going to take it to that particular city. So here risk transfers when the goods are handed to first carrier. Now there can be various carriers, during the transit. There can be a truck, there can be ship, there can be airplane and so on. So this is the first carrier, fine. So till the first carrier, the risk is borne by the seller as well as the transportation is borne by the seller, and the seller handles the export. Here export formalities are handled by the seller while the import formalities are handled by the buyer. Now here FCA stands for free carrier, it belongs to group F. Here main carriage is unpaid. Now if we look at the diagram, the truck on the timeline shows where the risk and cost transfers. Here it is positioned close to the seller's side. The cost bar and the risk bar both split at the same point, blue on the left, orange on the right. The export formalities box is blue, which is the seller's duty, and the import formalities box is in red, which is in orange, which is the buyer's duty. Now reading the three bullets, we can infer the seller delivers goods to the named carrier chosen by the buyer or to a named place agreed by the buyer. This could be seller's factory, a freight terminal or a customs depot. Risk transfers at the moment goods are handed to the first carrier. From that point, if the goods are damaged or lost, it is the buyer's problem. The seller handles export customs clearance. The buyer then arranges and pays for the main international freight. Free carrier is important under the Incoterm 2020 because of new provision added specifically for letter of credit transaction. Banks often require an on-board bill of lading as evidence of shipment. Under free carrier, goods are handed to a carrier before loading, so the traditional bill of lading is not issued. The 2020 rules now allow the buyer to instruct the carrier to issue an on-board bill of lading to the seller, solving the practical problem. Now here FAS stands for free alongside ship. Now this is a sea only Incoterm. Note that the transport indicators say sea and inland waterways only. Cost and risk are split here. The seller pays and bears the risk up to the point when the goods are placed alongside the ship at the loading port. Now alongside the ship, you see these goods are not loaded. Fine, they are still near the ship. So till here the seller is bearing the risk and paying for the transportation cost. The rest is borne by the buyer. The 3 points to note here are: the seller delivers when goods are placed alongside the vessel at the named port of loading. Alongside means on the quay or on the barge next to the ship, but not loaded on board. Risk and cost both transfer at the port quay. Once goods are alongside the ship, the seller does not load the goods. Loading is the buyer's responsibility. Free alongside ship is typically used for a bulk cargo, for example like grain, coal or timber, where goods are delivered in bulk to the port and the buyer's vessels comes to collect. In such trades, it is customary for port handling to be managed by the buyer's shipping agent. The distinction between free alongside ship and free on board is exactly one step. Free alongside ship transfers risk when the goods are alongside the ship. Free on board transfer risk when goods are on board the ship. The one step, loading, changes the liability. Now you can see here that the goods have now been loaded. So this loading charges is also paid by the seller. Now risk transfers once the goods are loaded to the ship. Fine. The 3 things to consider here are: the seller delivers goods on board the named vessel at the named port of loading. The seller is responsible for loading. Once goods cross the ship rail and are on board, delivery is complete. Risk transfers once goods are loaded on the ship. This is one step further than FAS. Now, FOB is the most used Incoterm in global trade for sea cargo. It is widely used for containerized cargo, dry, bulk and project cargo. Banks are familiar with it and most trade finance instruments are structured around it. One important point: FOB was historically defined as risk transferring when goods pass the ship rail. Incoterm 2010 and 2020 both updated this to when goods are on board the vessel, removing the ambiguity of the ship's rail system. Also note, FOB is a sea-only term. FOB continues to be widely used in practice even for containers. Now let us look at group C, which is carriage paid to. Carriage paid to here means seller, we can see from the blue rectangle, pays most of the transportation cost, while the insurance is still borne by the buyer. That is, the risk is still with the buyer and the risk is transferred early from seller to buyer. So we can see the cost bar is almost entirely blue. The seller is paying all the transportation of freight charges all the way to the named destination, but the risk bar splits much earlier, near the beginning of the journey. So the key insight is the seller pays freight beyond the risk transfer point. The seller pays for the journey during which the buyer is already bearing the risk. The practical implication is the seller pays more in terms of freight costs, but the buyer bears more risk during the main journey. This means the buyer should always arrange their own cargo insurance on top, even though CPT itself has no insurance obligations on the seller. CPT applies to all modes of transport. It is the multimodal equivalent of CFR, which is C only. Now, let us see the another terminology, that is CIP, carriage and insurance paid to, under group C. Now this is identical to carriage paid with one critical addition: the seller must provide for the insurance. This is reflected in insurance bar at the bottom of the diagram, spanning from the seller side almost all the way to the named destination. The diagram shows the same split pattern as CPT. Cost bar is entirely almost blue. Seller pays the freight to the destination. Risk bar splits early. Buyer bears risk from the first carrier, and now there is an additional green bar for insurance. Like CPT, the seller pays freight to the named destination and risk transfers when the goods are handed to the first carrier. The cost and risk split at different points, just as in CPT. A key update from Incoterm 2020: under CIP, the seller must provide for a comprehensive insurance, which is Institute Cargo Clauses A, which is the broadest possible cover. CIP is considered the best Incoterm for air cargo or multi-modal shipments where seller wants to provide the buyer with full insurance cover. It is increasingly used for high value manufactured goods and pharmaceutical shipments. The next is cost of freight. Sea and inland waterways are the only modes of transport here. The cost bar is mostly blue. Seller pays the freight to the destination port, but the risk bar splits at the loading port where goods are on board the vessel. This is same as FOB. Unlike FOB, where the buyer pays freight and bears risk from loading, under CFR, the seller pays freight but risk still transfers at the same moment when goods are on board the vessel. Think of it as CFR is equal to FOB plus seller pays freight. Same risk transfer point, seller takes on the freight cost. There is no insurance obligation under CFR. The seller has no duty to provide insurance. CFR is often used in trade for commodities like iron, ore, coal, agriculture products, where buyers are sophisticated enough to arrange their own insurance. For buyers who want the seller to also provide insurance, CIF is the appropriate choice. Now CIF, it stands for cost, insurance and freight. The diagram is identical to CFR in structure but with its addition of green insurance part, just as CIP added insurance to CPT. Costs are mostly blue, that is the seller pays freight to the destination port. The risk splits at the loading port when goods are on board. Insurance, here the seller provides the minimum insurance. The seller must provide minimum cargo insurance, specifically Institute Cargo Clause C, which covers a limited sets of perils such as fire, explosion, vessel sinking. CIF is the most widely used Incoterm for sea bulk cargo globally. Banks often require CIF for letter of credit transactions because the seller provides the insurance certificate, which is one of the documents presented under letter of credit. Now we enter Group D, that is arrival. In Group D, the seller brings goods all the way to the buyer's destination country. The seller bears risk for the longest portion of the journey, and we have DAP here, which is delivered at place. All transport modes are included in this. Now if we look at the diagram, everything is the cost, the risk, everything is borne by seller, and the goods are provided at the named destination, but they are not unloaded here. and risk transfer when the goods arrive at the destination ready to be unloaded by the buyer. Now, after this point, that is when the unloading will start, the buyer is going to be responsible for the goods, and hence the risk will transfer to the buyer. Now, next is delivered at place unloaded. In Incoterm 2010, this term was called delivered at terminal. In 2020, it was named as DPU and expanded. It can now be any named place, not just a terminal. Now here the diagram is nearly identical to DAP, but the difference here is that the seller now retains risk not just until the arrival, but until the goods are actually unloaded. So here till here, that is the unloaded part. Now the next is the delivered duty paid. This is the pinnacle of the seller's obligation. We can call it maximum seller obligation, and it is truly is. So if we look at the diagram, the cost and the risk bars are entirely blue, no orange at all. This means that the seller bears all cost and all risk for the entire journey from factory to the buyer's destination. Notice all the import formality box is also now blue. This is the only one Incoterm besides seller's own export formalities where formalities box is blue. So under DDP, the seller handles both export clearance and their own country import clearance in the buyer's country. This makes DDP unique. Here it is the maximum obligations for the seller. The buyer does nothing except to receive the goods. The buyer pays one price. Everything else is handled by the seller. Note that DDP is the mirror of EXW works, where EXW had maximum buyer obligation and here DDP has the maximum seller obligation. So we have covered a great deal of ground today. Let us look with quick takeaways. Takeaway 1, carriage risk is real. It means cargo loss, damage or unexpected delay in transit. Without addressing it upfront, disputes between buyer and sellers are inevitable. Takeaway 2, contracts prevent disputes. A written trade contract with all 12 elements we discussed must be agreed before shipment begins. Incoterm 6 at the heart of that contract. Incoterm 2020 is the framework of 11 terms across 4 groups, E, F, C and D, that standardizes who does what from minimum seller obligations under EXW all the way to maximum under DDP. Now that's all for today. See you in the next lecture. Thank you.